In war, there is a silent moment when the fate of millions changes, not because of a bomb, a tank, or a gunshot, but because of a number written on a piece of paper. On the cold morning of March 17, 1943, in Berlin, one of those numbers landed on the desk of Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence. The report stated something so absurd that it seemed like a lie created to confuse even the Nazi command itself. According to various sources around the world, a single American factory was producing a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber approximately every hour. To any aeronautical engineer of the time, this seemed impossible. The B-24 was no simple object. It was one of the most complex machines of the war, 4 Pratt & Whitney radial engines capable of generating more than 1,000 horsepower each, a long and heavy fuselage made of reinforced aluminum, 50 caliber machine gun turrets in various parts of the aircraft, fuel tanks that allowed it to cross oceans, and a compartment capable of carrying tons of bombs. Each plane had over 1 million individual parts: rivets, cables, hydraulic tubes, metal panels, delicate navigation instruments. Building just one of these bombers required thousands of hours of specialized labor. And yet the report claimed that the Americans were producing these machines as if they were automobiles. Canaris was not a man easily impressed. He had spent decades observing American industry, European politics, and the brutal workings of modern warfare. But that number didn't make sense. He slowly raised his eyes and looked at the officer who had handed him the document. "Did you check this?" he asked in a low voice. The officer replied that he had, 3 times. The information came from Spanish diplomats, businessmen traveling between Mexico and the United States, Swedish engineers who visited Detroit, and even intercepted letters written by American workers to family members in neutral Europe. They all said the same thing. There was a place called Willow Run near the city of Detroit where bombers were being built at a rate no country in the world had ever seen. Canaris knew that if this were true, Germany was facing a much bigger problem than it had imagined. Wars aren't won with just brave soldiers or brilliant strategies. Wars are won with production, fuel, metal, engines, and airplanes. Lots of airplanes. The Luftwaffe, the famous German air force that had dominated the skies of Europe at the beginning of the war, could produce a few hundred aircraft a month. But this report suggested something very different. It suggested an industrial avalanche coming from across the Atlantic. Still, there was a question that deeply troubled German analysts. How could a young democracy, formed by immigrants from dozens of different countries, produce war machines more efficiently than the most disciplined military regime in Europe? Nazi ideology said this was impossible. According to the regime's propaganda, American diversity made the country weak. Women shouldn't work in factories. Black people shouldn't operate complex machinery. Civilian workers couldn't replace trained military engineers. And yet, all the reports indicated exactly the opposite. They said thousands of women were working on the assembly lines. They said ordinary workers were learning complex tasks in just a few days. They said airplanes were literally crisscrossing the factory in a continuous production line. One of the analysts made a quick calculation that morning. If a bomber was produced every hour, that would mean 24 aircraft a day. More than 700 a month, more than 8,000 a year. He didn't say anything aloud, but everyone in the room came to the same silent conclusion. If those numbers were real, no European air defense would be sufficient. Canaris then made a decision that seemed simple but carried enormous political risk. He ordered German agents in the Americas to investigate Willow Run with utmost urgency. They needed concrete proof, photographs, worker counts, information on aluminum and engine shipments, any evidence that would confirm or refute that absurd story. Because at that moment, there were only 2 possibilities. Either the United States was conducting one of the greatest propaganda operations in history, or they were building an industrial machine capable of completely changing the balance of the war. As the officers left the room to send coded messages across the Atlantic, Canaris remained staring at the report on the table. He knew that the greatest threat to Germany might not be in Moscow, nor in London, Perhaps it was in a distant factory, where ordinary workers arrived every day, clocked in, and began assembling airplanes as if they were assembling cars. And if that were true, what would happen when hundreds of these bombers began appearing in the skies over Europe at the same time? That question remained unanswered. But within a few weeks, German spies would begin to uncover something even more unsettling, something that would make that report seem like only the beginning of a much larger story. While in Berlin, reports were analyzed with suspicion, thousands of kilometers away, something extraordinary was happening in silence. In the interior of the state of Michigan, near the city of Detroit, a gigantic structure was beginning to change the logic of modern warfare. Its name was Willow Run. To those who saw it from the outside, it looked like just a huge industrial building, but those who entered that place had the feeling of walking inside a small city covered in metal and glass. The building was so large that the assembly line was more than a kilometer long, and the workers said that when the winter was harsh and the hot air rose inside the factory, sometimes small clouds formed near the ceiling. That seemed like worker exaggeration, but the size of the place was truly difficult to comprehend. Imagine an American football field. Now imagine dozens of them placed side by side inside a single building. That was the size of the space where the United States was building one of the most important airplanes of World War II. Every day before dawn, thousands of people arrived to work there. Many came from small towns in the countryside. Others were farmers who had never seen a factory before the war. There were young people who had just finished school, men who had previously worked in mechanical workshops, and, for the first time on a large scale, women who decided to take on jobs that until then had been considered exclusively for men. Some of these women had husbands or brothers fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Others had young children at home. Even so, they all understood what was at stake. Each rivet placed on a bomber could mean protection for an American pilot flying thousands of meters above enemy territory. One of the factory supervisors recounted years later that the start of each shift felt like the beginning of a big game. Sirens blared, industrial lights flickered on, and thousands of workers walked to their positions with the same feeling a team has when they enter the field. Each person knew exactly what they needed to do. One installed hydraulic cables. Another fastened aluminum plates to the fuselage. Another assembled electrical systems on the instrument panel. It was repetitive work, but each movement had a clear purpose. The plane didn't stand still while the workers moved around it. On the contrary, the aircraft slowly advanced along the assembly line as each worker performed their task in sequence. It was the same principle that had transformed the American automotive industry decades earlier, now applied to the construction of war machines. And the result was something no other country had ever achieved before. At each stage of the production line, a B-24 Liberator began to take shape. First came the basic fuselage structure, then came the enormous metal wings capable of supporting 4 powerful radial engines. Next, the .50 caliber Browning machine gun turrets were installed, responsible for protecting the aircraft against enemy fighters. In the central compartment, engineers checked the space where tons of bombs destined for military targets in occupied Europe would be placed. For many workers, seeing that plane taking shape before their eyes was an experience difficult to explain. Some people said it felt like witnessing the birth of a giant. A mechanic named Jack, who had worked for years repairing cars before the war, recounted in an interview that the first time he saw a completed B-24 at the end of the assembly line, he remained silent for several minutes. According to him, at that moment it became clear that each small piece he tightened every day was part of something much larger. He wasn't just assembling an airplane, he was helping to build the force that would protect American pilots in the skies over Europe. This feeling was shared by thousands of people inside the factory. Many workers kept photos of relatives who served in the armed forces attached to metal lockers near the machines. Some wrote small messages inside the fuselages before closing the panels, as if sending a silent message to the pilots who would fly that aircraft months later. But there was one detail that made that factory even more impressive: the speed. Engineers began to realize that as workers gained experience, each stage of assembly became faster. Tasks were divided into thousands of smaller operations. This allowed new employees to learn specific functions in just a few days. It was a simple but extremely efficient system, and little by little the numbers began to rise. More airplanes, more engines installed, more wings coming off the production line. To those observing from inside the factory, it seemed like just another day of hard work. To those analyzing the data from the outside, it began to look like an industrial revolution applied directly to the battlefield. Meanwhile, the reports sent to Europe were becoming increasingly detailed. German spies were trying to understand how this production was possible. Some believed the information was exaggerated. Others thought the Americans were inflating numbers to intimidate their enemies. But the more they investigated, the harder it became to deny the reality. What was happening at Willow Run wasn't propaganda. It was engineering, organization, and collective work on a scale the world had never seen before. And then a question arose that began to seriously concern German military analysts. If a single American factory could produce bombers at that rate, how many other factories might be doing the same? Because if the answer was greater than they imagined, the skies over Europe could soon be filled with American planes. Enough planes to completely change the balance of the war. And at that moment, somewhere on the other side of the ocean, the first reports confirming this possibility were already being written. As production at Willow Run accelerated day by day, a steady stream of information began to flow across the Atlantic toward Europe. Spies, diplomats, and businessmen visiting the United States returned with reports that seemed impossible to ignore. A Swedish engineer described the factory as a river of moving metal. A Spanish diplomat stated that he had never seen machines operating with such precision for so many consecutive hours. Each new report confirmed the same conclusion. The United States was not just producing airplanes, they were producing airplanes on an industrial scale, reminiscent of automobile assembly lines. For the German analysts studying this data, it was a shock. For decades, European aeronautical engineering had been considered the most advanced in the world. Now, on the other side of the ocean, civilian workers were learning to assemble heavy bombers in a matter of days. How was this possible? The answer lay in the production method itself. American engineers had broken down the B-24 construction process into thousands of smaller tasks, each repeated continuously along the assembly line. Instead of a small group of specialists working for weeks on a single aircraft, thousands of workers performed specific operations in sequence. One installed rivets on the side panel, another connected fuel lines, another assembled navigation instruments. This division of labor created something akin to a gigantic clock. Each person was a cog, and when all the cogs turned together, the result was a complete bomber emerging at the end of the line. To those who grew up in American industrial cities, this seemed natural. But to European observers, accustomed to artisanal methods of aircraft production, it seemed a radical transformation of the very logic of warfare. Before long, the impact of this method began to show in the numbers. The time required to assemble a bomber decreased month after month. Workers who initially needed weeks to learn a task now mastered the function in a few days. Supervisors reported that new workers arrived at the factory on Monday and by Friday were already fully participating in the assembly line. This speed of learning impressed foreign visitors. But what really caught their attention was the constant pace of production. The plane didn't wait for the worker. The worker had to keep up with the plane's movement. This created a kind of industrial discipline, reminiscent of the precision of a military unit. Now imagine this line operating non-stop for entire shifts, day after day. What would happen if this system continued to grow without interruption? At the same time, another silent phenomenon began to develop within the factory. Workers who had never seen a fighter plane before the war began to deeply understand the machine they were building. Some knew exactly how the hydraulic systems that controlled the wing flaps worked. Others knew the position of each fuel tank inside the fuselage. Mechanics responsible for installing the radial engines could recognize small noises that indicated mechanical problems even before the engine was started for the first time. This familiarity with the aircraft transformed the factory environment. For many workers, the B-24 ceased to be just an industrial product. It became almost an invisible partner that would depart on a distant mission. It was not uncommon for workers to touch the newly painted fuselage before the plane left the assembly line, as if they were wishing good luck to the pilot who would fly that aircraft. Meanwhile, information reaching Europe continued to accumulate. German analysts began comparing data on rail transport, aluminum consumption, and aircraft engine production in the United States. The conclusions were worrying. American industry seemed capable of increasing production whenever necessary. Automobile factories were being adapted to manufacture aircraft components. Companies that previously produced household goods began manufacturing precision parts for navigation systems. It was as if the entire American economy had been reorganized to fuel the war. The question that began to arise among some German officers was simple but frightening. How many aircraft could emerge from this industrial system if it were pushed to its limits? At Willow Run, the workers didn't think about these strategic calculations. For them, the daily routine consisted of long shifts, noisy machines, and hot metal being shaped into wings and fuselages. Still, everyone sensed they were participating in something extraordinary. Some remembered spending entire days assembling just car parts before the war. Now they saw a complete bomber slowly advancing down the assembly line before their eyes. This contrast created a feeling difficult to explain. It was as if time was speeding up inside the factory. Planes that previously took weeks to build now appeared in a matter of hours, and each new plane meant greater range for the American Air Force. But something even more surprising was happening at that moment. Engineers began to realize that the assembly line wasn't just producing airplanes faster. It was creating a production standard that could be replicated in other factories. The Willow Run industrial model could be copied, adapted, and expanded. This meant that the speed of production could grow even further. Now imagine the impact of this on an air war that directly depended on the number of aircraft available. How many bombers would be needed to completely dominate the skies of an entire continent? As these questions arose, new reports began circulating among intelligence analysts in Europe. Some of them described something that seemed almost unbelievable. Foreign visitors claimed to have seen several bombers lined up at the end of the runway near the factory, ready to fly. Not just one or two planes, but dozens of them awaiting pilots. This meant that production had already exceeded immediate transport capacity. In other words, the planes were being built faster than they could be sent to war. For any military strategist, this was a clear sign of industrial superiority. But the most important question still remained unanswered. When all these planes finally began crossing the Atlantic and appearing over Europe, who would be able to stop them? In early 1944, something began to quietly shift in the skies over Europe. German pilots patrolling industrial routes began reporting increasingly larger formations of bombers crossing the horizon. At first, these were small groups, a few dozen aircraft that could be intercepted with great effort. But a few weeks later, the reports began to describe something very different, formations that seemed endless. Entire lines of bombers advancing at combat altitude, protected by escort fighters that moved around like silent guardians. To many Luftwaffe pilots, this seemed an impossible sight. During the early years of the war, Germany had dominated the skies over Europe. Now, slowly, that advantage was beginning to disappear. And the reason for this was not just in combat tactics or Allied pilots. The real reason lay thousands of kilometers away, inside American factories working day and night. At Willow Run, the routine continued with almost mechanical discipline. Shifts followed one another without interruption. Workers arrived before dawn, donned their hard hats, and walked through metal corridors illuminated by endless rows of industrial lamps. The sound was constant. Pneumatic hammers, cutting machines, engines being tested for the first time. For those visiting the site for the first time, the impression was of being inside a gigantic machine. Each station on the assembly line performed a small part of the process. One group installed the fuel tanks inside the wings. Another assembled the machine gun turrets. At another point in the factory, technicians connected kilometers of electrical cables that would control navigation and communication instruments. The final result slowly emerged at the end of the line, a B-24 Liberator ready to fly. This bomber had characteristics that made it one of the most important aircraft of the war. Its high-profile wing allowed for great flight range. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines provided enough power to transport heavy loads over long distances, and the array of 50-caliber machine guns distributed throughout the fuselage transformed the aircraft into a flying fortress capable of defending itself against attacks from enemy fighters. For American pilots, the B-24 was more than just a machine. It was the guarantee that they could cross the hostile skies of Europe with some chance of returning home. For the factory workers, each plane represented exactly that, the possibility of protecting someone flying on a mission over enemy territory. The statistics that emerged during that period began to surprise even the American engineers themselves. In a single month, hundreds of aircraft rolled off the assembly line. The pace of production steadily increased as workers perfected their tasks. Some supervisors recalled that, at the beginning of the project, many experts said it was impossible to produce heavy bombers using assembly line methods. Airplanes were considered too complex machines for that type of production. But the American experience showed exactly the opposite. By dividing the work into thousands of smaller operations, it was possible to build aircraft with surprising speed and precision. This approach reflected a deep-seated characteristic of American industrial culture, the belief that complex problems can be solved with organization, engineering, and collective work. Personal stories from within the factory helped illustrate this mentality. A worker named Margaret, who before the war worked in a small clothing store, became an expert in installing control cables inside the fuselage. She said that at first she was afraid of making mistakes, because she knew that each cable would help a pilot control the plane in the heat of battle. But over time, she developed such skill that she could complete her task with impressive speed. In interviews conducted years later, Margaret recalled that whenever a plane came off the assembly line, she felt that a small part of her was flying along with it. This feeling was shared by thousands of workers. They knew they were participating in something much bigger than a simple job. Meanwhile, military reports indicated that the presence of Allied bombers in the skies over Europe was increasing week by week. Some missions involved hundreds of aircraft flying in tight formation. For German fighter pilots, intercepting these groups became increasingly difficult. The bombers flew at high altitude, protecting each other with their machine guns. And when they were accompanied by long-range American fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang, the situation became even more complicated for the German defense. This new aerial balance began to change the pace of the war. Factories, fuel depots, and railway lines within occupied Europe became frequent targets. Each new wave of bombers demonstrated that American industrial capacity was reaching the battlefield. The numbers confirmed this change. In late 1943 and early 1944, aircraft production in the United States reached historic levels. Hundreds of thousands of workers were involved in building airplanes, engines, and components. Universities were training engineers and technicians at an accelerated pace. Small industrial towns were transforming into military production centers. This collective effort reflected a characteristic that many historians would highlight decades later: the United States' ability to mobilize its entire economy when faced with a global challenge. The combination of technology, organization, and determination created a force that was directly reflected in the skies over Europe. But there was one detail that made it all the more impressive. For the workers who tightened rivets or installed instruments inside the aircraft, the war often seemed distant. They didn't hear explosions or see battlefields. What they saw were airplanes being built, one after another, with increasing precision. Yet everyone inside the factory knew that those machines were not just industrial products. They were instruments that carried the hope of shortening the war and bringing soldiers home. And as new bombers continued to appear on the Willow Run assembly line, another question began to arise among military strategists around the world. If American production continued to grow at this impressive rate, how many more airplanes could emerge from this gigantic industrial machine before the war reached its decisive point? In the winter of 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer the same. German pilots taking off for interception missions began to realize that something had profoundly changed in the dynamics of aerial warfare. At the beginning of the conflict, encountering a group of enemy bombers was a significant event, something that required coordination and strategy to counter. Now, however, gigantic formations crossed the sky almost every day. First, they appeared as small silver dots on the horizon. Then the engines began to be heard, a deep, continuous sound that seemed to slowly grow until it filled the entire air. When they finally became visible, it was possible to count row after row of aircraft flying in close formation. It no longer looked like a group of planes. It looked like an entire fleet advancing across the continent. Each of these aircraft was a direct result of an industrial machine operating tirelessly across the Atlantic. While pilots prepared for their missions, workers in Detroit continued assembling bombers with discipline and precision. Inside Willow Run, the rhythm of the production line had become almost hypnotic. Every few minutes, a new set of wings advanced down the line. Metal fuselages emerged in sequence, followed by engines that were tested and adjusted before being installed. The repetitive work created a kind of constant industrial music. Rivets being fastened, aluminum sheets being shaped, engines being started for the first time. For those who worked there, that sound represented something very clear: more planes to protect soldiers and shorten the war. One of the most impressive aspects of American production was its adaptability. Engineers observed every step of the assembly line and sought ways to make it faster and more efficient. Small improvements emerged every month. Specialized tools were created to reduce the installation time of certain components. New training methods allowed workers to learn complex functions in just a few days. Over time, the results of these improvements began to show in the numbers. Monthly bomber production reached levels that few military strategists had imagined possible just a few years earlier. At certain times, hundreds of aircraft rolled out of a single factory in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, these machines were beginning to demonstrate their true impact. Strategic bombing missions became increasingly frequent. Large formations of B-24s and B-17s flew at high altitude, protecting each other with their machine guns. When German fighters attempted to approach, they were met by an extremely dangerous network of defensive fire. Furthermore, new American escort fighters with long range began to accompany the bombers throughout the mission. This completely changed the dynamics of aerial combat. Before, German interceptors could wait for the bombers to arrive alone over European territory. Now they also had to contend with fast and highly maneuverable fighters. Accounts from German pilots of that era described the feeling of facing an enemy that seemed endless. On some missions, they observed successive waves of aircraft crossing the sky for hours. Even when they managed to shoot down some bombers, other formations continued to appear on the horizon. For many experienced pilots, this indicated that aerial warfare had entered a new phase. It was no longer a balanced contest between two similar forces. It was the direct result of a gigantic difference in the industrial capacity of the nations involved. On the American side, the pilots flying these missions were also fully aware of the importance of the factories behind each aircraft. Many of them recalled that, before taking off for an operation over enemy territory, they would walk around the plane, observing details of the fuselage and engines. Some said it was impossible to look at those machines without thinking about the thousands of people who had participated in their construction. Every rivet, every electrical cable, every instrument on the panel had been placed there by someone who believed in the collective effort to win the war. This invisible connection between workers and pilots created a profound sense of responsibility. At the same time, new statistics began circulating among Allied military strategists. American aircraft production was reaching extraordinary numbers. Factories scattered across the country were producing not only bombers, but also fighter jets, engines, and essential components. Universities were training engineers at an accelerated pace. Small industrial towns were transforming into centers of military production. This national effort reflected a fundamental principle of American culture. When freedom is threatened, the answer comes from the union of technology, labor, and determination. But even with all this impressive production, the workers at Willow Run rarely saw the final result of their efforts. For them, each day was just another shift on an endless assembly line. Planes would appear at the end of the factory and be quickly sent to air bases or transport ports. The war remained distant from that industrial environment. Still, everyone knew they were participating in something historic. With each completed bomber, the Air Force operating over Europe increased. It was precisely at this moment that a new perception began to emerge among military observers around the world. If American production had already reached such high levels in 1944, what would happen if this capacity continued to grow in the following years? How many more planes could come out of these gigantic factories? How many bomber formations could cross the skies of Europe if the assembly line continued to operate day and night? These questions began to circulate among strategists, pilots, and intelligence analysts, and the answer that began to take shape was both impressive and decisive. Because the true strength behind these aircraft was not just metal or engines, it was the capacity of an entire nation to transform its industry into a machine capable of sustaining the war until the moment of victory. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the contrast between two worlds became impossible to ignore. On one side were destroyed cities, paralyzed factories, and retreating armies. On the other side, something entirely different existed, an industrial force that continued producing airplanes with the same discipline it had begun years before. While the Third Reich disintegrated, American assembly lines were still running. And inside those factories, thousands of workers continued doing exactly what they had done since the beginning of the war: arrive, work, and build airplanes. What began as an industrial experiment at Willow Run transformed into one of the greatest demonstrations of productive capacity in modern history. Throughout the war, thousands of B-24 Liberator bombers were built in that single factory. Each one represented thousands of hours of labor, tons of metal, and the quiet dedication of ordinary people who decided to contribute to something bigger than their own lives. Many of those workers never flew a plane. Some never even saw a battlefield. Yet every part they installed helped change the course of the aerial war. For the pilots who flew these aircraft, the meaning was deeply personal. At air bases scattered across England and other parts of Europe, crews walked towards their bombers before dawn. The chill of the early morning was broken by the sound of engines starting one after the other. Each plane carried a crew of young men who knew exactly the risk they were taking. Strategic bombing missions could last many hours. Enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and extreme weather conditions were part of the reality of each flight. Still, they took off because they believed their work would help shorten the war. There's a moment many pilots would remember decades later. The moment the plane finally left the runway and began to slowly climb toward the clouds. When that happened, some looked out the side window and watched the gigantic wings supporting the aircraft in the air. And there, in that silent instant, many thought of the people who had built that machine, workers they might never meet personally, but who had placed each rivet with precision to ensure the plane could withstand the stresses of flight and combat. At the same time, inside American factories, daily life continued to be marked by a collective sense of responsibility. Historians who have studied that period often highlight an important aspect of American culture during the war: the conviction that each person could contribute in some way to the national effort. Farmers produced food to supply soldiers, engineers designed new equipment, workers assembled engines, wings, and fuselages. This shared effort created something that many veterans describe as a spirit of unity, rarely seen at other times. And perhaps that's precisely where the emotional twist in this story lies. For years, many enemies of democracy believed that free societies were weak. They said that cultural diversity created disorganization. They said that civilian workers couldn't compete with militarized regimes. But history has shown something different. It has shown that when millions of free people work towards a common goal, the result can be an extraordinary force. A force capable of producing technology, courage, and resilience at levels that surprise even the participants themselves. When the war ended, many of those workers returned to their normal lives. Some went back to small towns, others continued in industrial or technical careers. Many pilots returned home and tried to rebuild their lives after years of combat. Still, they all carried the memory of a time when ordinary people participated in something that changed the world. Airplanes born in factories like Willow Run had crossed oceans, faced storms, and fought in some of the most dangerous skies in history. Today, when we look back, it's easy to see only numbers. The number of planes produced, tons of metal used, statistics on air missions. But behind these numbers were human stories, stories of courage, hard work, and cooperation between people who may never have met in person, but who shared the same purpose. And that's exactly why this story remains relevant today, because it shows what can happen when determination, technology, and democratic values go hand in hand. If you've made it this far, it means this story has also sparked something in you. Perhaps curiosity about how these machines were built, perhaps admiration for the pilots who flew these missions. Or perhaps respect for the ordinary people who worked silently in the factories while the world faced one of the most difficult moments in its history. Now I want to hear from you. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring true stories of military aviation and the men and women who helped shape the 20th century. Like this video so more people can learn about these stories, and leave your questions, opinions, or family memories about this period in history in the comments. Because every comment can help keep alive the memory of a generation that literally built the wings of freedom.